A pregnant woman faced a giant snake in the forest and found her reason to live in the lonely hunter, in the unforgiving wilderness of the American frontier, where survival depends on courage and quick thinking. One woman's desperate encounter with nature's deadliest predator would change their lives forever. This is the story of an unexpected bond forged in the face of mortal danger, where a pregnant woman on the run discovers that sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely places. If you're already enjoying this type of content, leave a like to support me. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Colorado Territory as Elizabeth McKinnon clutched her swollen belly, stumbling through the dense pine forest. 6 months pregnant and utterly alone, she had been walking for 3 days since fleeing her abusive husband's homestead. Her worn leather boots were barely holding together, and her blue calico dress was torn in several places from catching on branches and thorns. The year was 1876, and the frontier was no place for a woman alone, especially one carrying a child. But Elizabeth had reached her breaking point when Thomas, a husband of 2 years, had struck her belly during one of his drunken rages. The bruises on her arms had faded, but the fear for her unborn child had only grown stronger. She pressed deeper into the wilderness, following a barely visible deer trail that wound between towering ponderosa pines. The morning air was crisp and thin at this elevation, making each breath a conscious effort. Her stomach growled with hunger. She had finished the last of her hardtack and dried meat the previous evening, and her water supply was running dangerously low. The forest around her was alive with sounds: the distant call of a hawk circling overhead, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and the whisper of wind through the pine needles. But there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up, a subtle wrongness in the natural symphony that spoke of danger. Elizabeth paused beside a fallen log, pressing her hand against a tree trunk for support. Her back ached terribly, and her feet were blistered and swollen. She had no idea where she was going, only that she needed to get as far away from Thomas as possible. The nearest town was probably days away, and she wasn't even sure she was heading in the right direction. As she rested, she thought about the life growing inside her. This child would be born into a world of uncertainty, but at least it would be born free from the violence that had consumed her marriage. She had saved every penny she could hide from Thomas, sewing coins into the lining of her dress, but it wasn't much. Enough perhaps for a week's lodging and food, if she could find a town that would accept a woman alone. The sound of running water caught her attention, and she pushed forward eagerly. A small creek wound its way through the forest, the water clear and cold as it tumbled over smooth stones. Elizabeth knelt carefully, cupping the precious liquid in her hands and drinking deeply. The coldness was shocking but refreshing, and she splashed some on her face, washing away the dust and sweat of her journey. She was refilling her small canteen when she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. A low, rhythmic scraping, like something large being dragged across the forest floor. Elizabeth froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The forest had gone completely silent, as if every creature had suddenly vanished. The scraping grew louder, closer. Elizabeth forced herself to move, backing away from the creek while trying to remain as quiet as possible. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps, and she pressed her free hand against her belly, as if she could somehow protect the child within. Then she saw it. Emerging from a cluster of boulders near the creek was the largest snake she had ever seen, easily 20 feet long and as thick as a man's torso. The massive rattlesnake moved with deadly purpose. Its diamond-patterned scales caught the dappled sunlight, and its triangular head swayed from side to side as it tasted the air with a forked tongue. Elizabeth's legs turned to water. She had heard stories of giant rattlesnakes in the high country, but seeing one in person was beyond her worst nightmares. The creature was ancient, probably decades old, and had grown to monstrous proportions in the isolation of the wilderness. The snake's head turned toward her, and she saw its eyes, cold, alien, and completely without mercy. It had caught her scent, and now it was deciding whether she was prey or threat. Elizabeth knew that either way, the outcome would likely be the same. She tried to back away slowly, but her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled. The sound was small, but in the deadly silence of the forest, it might as well have been a gunshot. The snake's head snapped toward her, and she heard the distinctive rattle that would haunt her nightmares for years to come. The massive serpent began to coil, its body gathering like a spring, preparing to strike. Elizabeth knew she had seconds at most. She was too far from any tree to climb, too pregnant to run, and completely defenseless. As the snake's head drew back, she closed her eyes and wrapped her arms around her unborn child, whispering a prayer she hoped someone would hear. If you're enjoying the video so far, a like and subscribe to the channel really helps. The crack of a rifle split the morning air like thunder, echoing off the surrounding peaks. Elizabeth's eyes snapped open to see the massive snake's head explode in a shower of blood and scales. The creature's body writhed violently for several seconds. Before going still, its death throes carving deep grooves in the forest floor. Standing 30 yards away, partially concealed by a cluster of aspen trees, was a man unlike any Elizabeth had ever seen. He was tall and lean, with shoulder-length dark hair and a face weathered by years of sun and wind. His clothes were practical, frontier-wear buckskin jacket, wool pants, and boots that had seen countless miles. But it was his eyes that struck her most. Pale blue and intense, like winter sky. He lowered his rifle, a Winchester Model 1873, and approached cautiously. His movements were fluid and silent, like a predator himself. Elizabeth noticed he kept the weapon ready, his eyes constantly scanning the forest around them. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. There was no warmth in his tone, but no hostility either, just the practical concern of someone used to dealing with emergencies. Elizabeth tried to speak, but found her voice had abandoned her. She shook her head, still trembling from the encounter. The man nodded and approached the dead snake, using his boot to turn the massive head. 22 feet, I'd guess, he said, more to himself than to her. Been tracking this one for 3 days. Killed 2 horses and a mule up at the Morrison ranch. He glanced at her, taking in her condition with a single, comprehensive look. "You're a long way from anywhere, ma'am." Elizabeth finally managed to speak, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain her situation to this stranger? How could she tell him she was fleeing an abusive husband, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a few hidden coins? The man seemed to understand her reluctance. "Name's Jacob Thornton," he said simply. "I hunt for the settlements up north. You look like you could use some help." Elizabeth studied his face, searching for any sign of the cruelty she had learned to recognize in Thomas. But Jacob's expression was neutral, almost disinterested. He wasn't looking at her the way men usually did, with either desire or dismissal. He was simply assessing the situation like he might assess wounded game. "Elizabeth," she said finally. "Elizabeth McKinnon." Jacob nodded. "Mrs. McKinnon, you're about 6 months along, I'd guess. Walking alone in this country, in your condition, ... He shook his head. "Either you're running from something, or you're the most foolish woman in Colorado territory." The bluntness of his statement should have offended her, but instead, Elizabeth found it oddly comforting. After years of Thomas's manipulative lies and false charm, Jacob's straightforward honesty was refreshing. "Running," she admitted quietly. Jacob studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Well, you can't stay here. This snake had a mate somewhere, and she'd be looking for what killed her partner. Plus, you're leaving a scent trail that every predator in 50 miles can follow." He shouldered his rifle and began walking back toward the trees. "Got a camp about 2 miles north. You can rest there while I figure out what to do with you." "I'm not asking for charity," Elizabeth said quickly. "I can pay." "I'm not asking for payment," Jacob interrupted. "I'm asking if you want to live long enough to see that baby born." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. She had been strong for so long, had endured so much, but this stranger's matter-of-fact kindness was almost too much to bear. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Jacob's camp was a marvel of frontier efficiency. A lean-to shelter was built against a large boulder, providing protection from wind and weather. A fire ring was carefully constructed with stones, and his supplies were organized with military precision. Everything spoke of a man who had learned to live alone and like it. He helped her sit on a fallen log near the fire and handed her a cup of coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. Elizabeth sipped it gratefully, feeling the warmth spread through her chilled body. "How long you been out here?" Jacob asked, settling across from her with his own cup. 3 days, Elizabeth replied. "I left our homestead 3 days ago." "Where's your husband?" The question was direct, but not accusatory. Elizabeth found herself answering truthfully, "Probably passed out drunk." "He won't miss me for a while." Jacob nodded. "And when he sobers up, he'll come looking." Elizabeth's voice was barely above a whisper. "Thomas doesn't like to lose his possessions." Something flickered across Jacob's face, a brief flash of anger that was quickly suppressed. "You're not a possession, Mrs. McKinnon. You're a person, and that baby you're carrying deserves better than a father who sees it as property." Elizabeth looked up at him in surprise. Most men of the frontier had very definite ideas about a woman's place. But Jacob spoke with the conviction of someone who had seen the world differently. "You ever been married, Mr. Thornton?" Jacob's expression closed off immediately. "Once. Long time ago." He stood abruptly, clearly indicating the subject was closed. "Get some rest. We'll talk about your situation when you're stronger." As Elizabeth settled into the blanket he provided, she watched Jacob move around the camp with practiced efficiency. He cleaned his rifle with the care of a man whose life depended on his weapon, then began preparing what looked like a simple but nourishing meal. For the first time in months, Elizabeth felt something she had almost forgotten: safety. This strange, solitary man had saved her life without asking for anything in return. She didn't know what his story was, but she sensed that, like her, he was running from something. Leave a comment about what you think of this story so far. Elizabeth woke to the sound of Jacob moving quietly around the camp. The morning sun was just beginning to filter through the trees, and she realized she had slept more soundly than she had in months. Jacob had kept the fire burning low through the night, and the warmth had been more comforting than any bed. "How you feeling?" Jacob asked without looking up from where he was preparing breakfast. His voice was still gruff, but there was an undertone of genuine concern that hadn't been there the day before. "Better," Elizabeth replied, stretching carefully. Her back still ached, and the baby was particularly active this morning, but the terror of the previous day had faded into something more manageable. Jacob handed her a plate of beans and salt pork, along with hardtack softened in the bean juice. It wasn't fancy, but it was the best meal she'd had since leaving Thomas's homestead. "Been thinking about your situation," Jacob said as he settled down with his own plate. "There's a town called Cedar Ridge about 40 miles north. Small place, but they've got a doctor and decent folks. Might be a place for you to start over." Elizabeth nodded, though her heart sank. 40 miles might as well have been 400 in her condition. "I appreciate the advice, Mr. Thornton. I'll head that way once I'm rested." Jacob gave her a sharp look. "Alone, in your condition? You'd be dead before you made it 10 miles. Then what do you suggest?" Elizabeth asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "I can't stay here forever, and I won't go back to Thomas." "Didn't say you should." Jacob stood and began packing his gear with characteristic efficiency. "I'll take you there. Got business in that area anyway." Elizabeth stared at him in shock. "You'd do that? For a stranger?" Jacob paused in his packing. "My business anyway," he repeated, but his tone suggested there was more to it than that. They broke camp within the hour, Jacob showing Elizabeth how to pack efficiently and move through the forest without leaving obvious signs of their passage. He was a patient teacher, explaining how to step on rocks and hard ground to avoid leaving tracks, how to break branches in ways that looked natural, and how to read the signs that would tell them if they were being followed. "You expecting trouble?" Elizabeth asked as they walked. "Always expect trouble out here," Jacob replied. "That's how you stay alive." But Elizabeth noticed that he kept glancing back the way they had come, and she realized he was specifically watching for signs of Thomas. The thought that her husband might already be tracking her made her stomach clench with fear. They traveled slowly, stopping frequently to rest. Jacob seemed to understand her limitations, without her having to explain them, and he never showed impatience with their pace. During one of their stops, as Elizabeth rested against a fallen log, she worked up the courage to ask about his past. "You mentioned you were married once," she said carefully. Jacob's expression hardened. "Not a story worth telling. Sometimes talking helps," Elizabeth said gently. "You've listened to my troubles." Jacob was quiet for so long that Elizabeth thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, in a voice so low she had to strain to hear it, he began to speak. "Her name was Mary. We had a little place down in New Mexico territory. She was everything good in the world." He paused, his hands clenching into fists. "Raiders came through one day while I was out hunting. Comancheros selling guns to the Apache. They burned the house, killed the livestock, and ... double quotes. He couldn't finish the sentence. Elizabeth felt tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry. Been 5 years," Jacob said, his voice empty. "Tracked them down, every last one. Didn't bring her back, but it was something." "Is that why you live alone out here?" Jacob nodded. "Easier than trying to pretend the world makes sense." They continued their journey in comfortable silence, but Elizabeth found herself seeing Jacob in a new light. He wasn't just a solitary hunter, he was a man who had lost everything, and was trying to find a way to live with the pain. On the second day of their journey, Elizabeth's worst fears were realized. Jacob suddenly stopped, his body going rigid, as he listened to something she couldn't hear. "What is it?" she whispered. "Horses." Jacob said grimly. 3 of them, maybe 4, coming fast. Elizabeth's heart began to race. Thomas, probably. He'd bring friends. His brothers. They. They're not good men, Mr. Thornton. Jacob's expression turned deadly serious. How not good? They've killed before. They think they're above the law because the nearest sheriff is 100 miles away. Jacob nodded, already moving to find defensive positions. Stay low and quiet. Whatever happens, don't show yourself unless I tell you to. He positioned Elizabeth behind a cluster of large rocks, then took up a position about 20 yards away, where he had a clear view of the trail they had been following. His rifle was ready, and Elizabeth noticed he had extra ammunition laid out within easy reach. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and soon Elizabeth could hear voices. Thomas's distinctive drawl, and the rougher tones of his brothers, Jake and Samuel. They were angry, and they were armed. Trail goes cold here, she heard Samuel say. They went to ground somewhere. That bitch won't get far, Thomas replied, his voice slurred with drink. She's carrying too much weight to move fast. The crude comment about her pregnancy made Elizabeth's blood boil, but she forced herself to stay hidden. Jacob had been right about one thing. These men were dangerous, and she couldn't afford to let emotion override caution. Could be they had help, Jake suggested. Saw signs of another horse back a ways. Don't matter, Thomas said. Elizabeth's mine, and I'll kill any man who tries to keep her from me. From her hiding place, Elizabeth saw Jacob's knuckles whiten as he gripped his rifle. The deadly stillness about him reminded her of the moments before he had killed the giant snake. Focused, patient, and absolutely lethal. If this content is being useful, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support me. The confrontation came swiftly and without warning. Thomas and his brothers had dismounted and were examining the ground where Jacob had tried to obscure their tracks, when Jacob's voice cut through the forest like a blade. That's far enough. The 3 men spun around, hands reaching for their weapons, but Jacob already had them covered. He stood partially concealed behind a large pine, his rifle trained on Thomas's chest. You boys are on the wrong trail, Jacob said, his voice calm and conversational. Suggest you turn around and head back where you came from. Thomas's face twisted with rage. You got my wife up there, mister. She's carrying my child, and I want her back. Don't see any wife, Jacob replied. Just see 3 men with guns, who are making me nervous. Samuel, the youngest of the brothers, started to move his hand toward his pistol. Jacob's rifle shifted slightly, and Samuel froze. I wouldn't, Jacob said quietly. I can put 3 shots center mass before any of you clear leather. Question is, which one of you wants to be first? Elizabeth had never heard such cold menace in a human voice. Jacob wasn't bluffing or posturing. He was simply stating facts. She could see Thomas realizing the same thing. Look, mister, Thomas said, trying to sound reasonable. I don't know what sob story my wife told you, but she's not right in the head. Pregnancy makes some women peculiar. She needs to come home where she belongs. Funny thing about that, Jacob said. Woman I talked to seemed pretty clear-headed to me. Said she was running from a man who liked to use his fists. That sound familiar? Thomas's face flushed red with anger. What happens between a man and his wife ain't your business. Made it my business when you decided to track her through my hunting grounds. Jacob's voice dropped even lower. Now you've got 2 choices. You can turn around and ride out, or you can draw those guns and see how it plays out. The tension in the air was so thick, Elizabeth could barely breathe. She knew that Jacob was outnumbered, but there was something about his absolute stillness that made her believe he could do exactly what he threatened. It was Jake, the eldest brother, who broke the standoff. Tom, this ain't worth dying over. There's other women. She's got my child, Thomas snarled. You'll have other children, Jake said firmly. But not if you're dead. This man's a killer, Tom. I can see it in his eyes. Elizabeth watched as the brothers weighed their options. Finally, Thomas spat on the ground and began backing toward his horse. This ain't over, he called to Jacob. I'll find her eventually. No, Jacob said with quiet finality. You won't. Because if I ever see you in this country again, I'll kill you on sight. That's not a threat, it's a promise. The 3 men mounted their horses and rode away. But Elizabeth noticed that Jacob kept his rifle ready until the sound of hoofbeats had completely faded. Only then did he lower his weapon and call for her to come out. They'll be back, Elizabeth said, her voice shaking. No, Jacob said firmly. They won't. Men like that are bullies. They only fight when they're sure they can win. Today showed them they can't. Over the following days, as they completed their journey to Cedar Ridge, Elizabeth found herself seeing Jacob in yet another new light. He wasn't just a protector, he was a man slowly coming back to life. She caught him watching her sometimes, with an expression she couldn't quite read, and she realized that saving her had somehow begun to heal something in him. Cedar Ridge turned out to be a small but thriving community, nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-capped peaks. The doctor, a kind man named Harrison, examined Elizabeth and pronounced both mother and baby healthy. More importantly, the town was in need of a schoolteacher, and Elizabeth's education made her a perfect candidate. "I'll be staying in the area," Jacob told her, as they stood outside the doctor's office. "Got some business with the territorial government about hunting licenses." Elizabeth suspected this was an excuse to stay close and make sure Thomas didn't follow through on his threats. But she didn't call him on it. Instead, she surprised herself by reaching out and taking his hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Jacob looked down at their joined hands, and for a moment, his carefully maintained emotional walls cracked. "Mary would have wanted me to help," he said quietly. "She always said every child deserved a chance at a good life. Your Mary sounds like she was a wonderful woman." She was. Jacob squeezed her hand gently, "and she'd be happy to know her. Death meant something good came of it." Elizabeth felt tears in her eyes. "You've saved 2 lives out there, Jacob. Mine and my baby's. That's not a small thing." 6 months later, Elizabeth McKinnon gave birth to a healthy daughter she named Mary, after the woman whose memory had saved them both. Jacob was there for the birth, pacing the doctor's office like an expectant father, and he was the first person besides Elizabeth to hold the baby. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like her mother." Elizabeth looked up at him, seeing the love in his eyes that he was still too afraid to voice. "She's going to need a father, Jacob. A real father, who'll love her and protect her." "I'm just a hunter," Jacob said, but his protest was weak. "You're the best man I've ever known," Elizabeth replied. "And if you'll have us, we'd like to be your family." Jacob looked down at the baby in his arms, then at Elizabeth, and for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled. "I reckon Mary would like that," he said. Both of them. The wedding was small, held in the Cedar Ridge church, with the whole town in attendance. Elizabeth wore a simple white dress that the women of the town had sewn for her, and Jacob had even gotten a haircut and worn his best clothes. As they exchanged vows, Elizabeth caught sight of Thomas watching from the back of the church, his face twisted with rage. But Jacob had seen him too, and after the ceremony, he walked slowly toward the back of the church. Elizabeth couldn't hear what he said to Thomas, but she saw her former husband's face go white with fear before he turned and fled. "What did you tell him?" Elizabeth asked. When Jacob returned, Jacob shrugged. "Just reminded him about our previous conversation." Some men need their memory refreshed from time to time. Years later, as Elizabeth watched Jacob teach their daughter how to track animals through the forest, she often thought about that day when she had faced death in the form of a giant snake. She had been alone, desperate, and certain that her story was ending. Instead, it had been the beginning of the most beautiful chapter of her life. The wilderness that had nearly claimed her had instead given her everything she had ever wanted. A man who loved her completely, a safe home for her child, and the knowledge that sometimes the most unlikely encounters can change everything. Jacob had found his way back to life through loving them, and Elizabeth had found her strength through his protection. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies, proving that even in the harsh frontier, love could bloom in the most unexpected places. If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts and answering questions. What was your favorite part of Elizabeth and Jacob's story? Leave your comment below and let's discuss it. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next